All right. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of introduction. Not that you need
Yes, sir.
one, but for the benefit of the folks at home. It's Monday, July 28th, 2025. I'm Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today via Zoom is Paul Begala, political strategist and commentator, widely recognized for his role as chief strategist alongside his longtime colleague, James Carville, in the 1992 Clinton Gore presidential campaign. Of course, prior to that, he was the lead strategist for Zell Miller's successful 1990 Georgia gubernatorial campaign. He's remained a fixture in political media, co-hosting shows like Equal Time and Crossfire. Paul, thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule to talk, take a walk down memory lane about your time in Georgia politics and especially your time working with Governor Miller.
Oh, thank you, Ashton. This is an honor. It really is. It'll be a
Well,
privilege.
I appreciate it. And you can tell a unique story about your time with the governor, somebody who's had worn many hats and had many careers in Georgia politics. But let's start at the beginning. You grew up in Texas, but you're from New
hmm
Jersey originally. Is that
hmm
right?
Born in New Jersey, grew up in Texas.
So what was it like? If I'm remembering correctly, you were in Fort Bend County, so
Wow, that's right.
suburban Houston.
Now, but then was rural. It was a
Right,
small
right.
town. They put in a freeway to Houston and the oil boom, which is what made Houston devour my little town. But if you ever have time, I'm serious, you
Mhm.
should. You can get it on Netflix. Watch the Sugarland Express.
Okay,
Steven Spielberg's first movie,
that's right.
which he filmed in my hometown. I actually lived in Missouri City, but we didn't have a high school. So I went to high school in Sugarland. I generally tell people I'm from Sugarland. It's still more famous because of Spielberg. But it's a prison break movie. And we have a prison in town and a sugar mill. So the city founders were smart enough to call it Sugarland, not Prison Land. But it was a small town. It was close enough to Houston that you could like go to Astros games or something. But
Mhm.
I loved it, and I the friends I had were all really much more deeply rooted, and so I really grew up with a sense of the identity of small town Texas. It was very different from Georgia, but not all that different. It's not like I was from Brooklyn.
So, growing up in your family was politics something that was a topic of discussion, or were you, one of those the oddball in the family who just wanted to follow,
Yeah,
politics
but
and
I
public
don't. My parents
affairs?
weren't terribly political.
Mm.
I know they voted; they were good citizens. But it wasn't like a hot topic. I was one of five, and so there was like the hotter topics were like, did your big brother come home last night? Did your little brother wreck the car? Whatever.
Right.
It was much more normal. More normal small town family.
So, you went to the University of Texas, at Austin, known for its subpar to mediocre football team.
The
No,
only team
all
we
in all
can't beat is
serious,
Georgia, but we're gonna get you back. We're coming.
no doubt, eventually, no doubt. But UT, fantastic school, of course. What took you to UT instead of one of the other fine institutions in Texas or elsewhere?
Yeah, I didn't. It's hard to imagine that my kids are now all four out of college, but we didn't have college tours. We didn't have anything. It wasn't like it back then. I graduated high school in 1979. And I had a big sister who was at the University of Texas. And so I got on the Continental Trailways bus in Sugar Land, Texas by myself and went up to Austin to spend a weekend with her. And I got off that bus. I could tell you right where the bus stopped because I got off that bus and I never saw so many pretty girls in my life. And I came home after that weekend. I told my parents I'm going to the University of Texas. I said, that's nice. That was it. That was my college search, my college tour. Didn't apply anywhere else. Wasn't interested anywhere else. Back then, because I'm at the very tail end of the baby boom,
Mhm.
it was incredibly easy. It's embarrassing how easy it was. And Texas is a good school, but it was really easy to get in. And it was $4 a credit. So my dad was a salesman. My mother was a homemaker. We were not well off. We weren't poor or anything, but I mean, he was raising five kids on a salesman's salary. And it was so easy to go to a great state university. And that had the formative experience of my life. That's where I got into politics. I was a student body president in high school too, but I got into campus politics, student body president there, and really became very intensely political in college. I was a government major. And it was that experience of being in this enormous place, 52,000 students, spectacularly diverse. My high school only had 2 Jews. I didn't know it, Matt and Dana, the Levine twins, and they were friends of mine, but like I didn't know anything about Jewish culture. We had a lot of black kids, a lot of white kids, a lot of Mexican American kids. So that was pretty diverse. But like the whole world, like I went to college with Palestinians and Iranians, and it just was wonderful. And I get excited talking about it. Frankly, it's why I love UGA. I have a nephew who went there. I taught at the law school for a semester, and
That's right. Yeah.
and loved it. And it's a similar sort of thing. You take people and throw them all together, and so that's where I got into politics. And it taught me then and now about trying to form diverse coalitions and trying to actually make a difference in people's lives. And to me, those are the 2 keys, frankly, to Zell or any other successful politician.
Did you work on campaigns or volunteer?
Oh yeah.
While you were in college?
All the time. I had a county commissioner who was the most dynamic person you ever saw and decided to run for state treasurer in 1982, Ann Richards. I went door to door for Ann. Like she needed help in the student precincts. Okay, she won a landslide. But yes, I was in every local political cause, knocking on doors. Pro tip: bring dog biscuits.
Yeah.
I'm a dog guy, but it's not all dogs are people guys. And so if you give them a dog biscuit, they love you. Then the owner loves you, and then they might vote for Ann Richards. Or like I interned for my state senator, Lloyd Doggett, who's now a very senior member of Congress. He was my state senator then. He was a great mentor to me. And so, yes, I was the most sort of politically obsessed college kid you ever saw.
Lloyd Doggett, he succeeded in his House, that district. One of my favorite political names, J.J. Pickle.
Jake Pickle. I knew Jake. Jake Pickle was John Connolly's campaign manager for student body president at the University of Texas. And Jake was the most dynamic, exciting. Jake Pickle, God rest his soul, is the reason Austin is a tech capital.
Really?
He got a bunch of pork. He got federal money to come to Austin to build MCC, which was a very early chip maker and semiconductor maker, financed by the federal government. And it worked. Jake, he was just, I wish you knew him. He was really, really dynamic. My wife, also a UT grad, one of her mentors, not mine, was Barbara Jordan, who taught at the LBJ school. And Diane was hand selected to be one of 10 kids in her seminar. And Professor Jordan used to say, I don't believe there is a hand in the 10th congressional district that Jake has not shaken. And she said that with admiration. She was very cerebral, but she could respect a really good visceral politician. So yeah, right. Jake took over for Homer Thornberry, who became a federal judge, and Homer took over for Lyndon Baines Johnson. So I hadn't been to 4 congressmen there in my mother's lifetime.
Right. It's sort of like starting quarterback for the Green Bay Packers or something like that.
There's a legacy there. There's something.
Well, so it sounds like you found the passion was in politics and campaigning, but you did probably the smart thing and went to law school. Was that the career path, or was that sort of the thing you thought you needed to do while you were trying to
I was back and forth. I was in and out of law school. I went to law school. I graduated in '83. I worked for 2 years in campaigns with no success, but I met Carville. We became best friends and business partners, and he didn't have any success either. We just kept losing. So after the elections, I'd come back to Austin because I was in love with this girl who got her undergrad and then was getting 2 masters. One at the LBJ school and one at the business school. So she got MBA, Master of Public Affairs. So she was in school forever. And she was rooted, and I was not. And so I kept coming back to Austin really just to hang out with this chick, and went to law school. I went to law school because it was hard and harder, and I needed some intellectual discipline. My undergraduate degree in government was fine, but I was flatty intellectually. And law school was hard, and I loved that. I never wanted to practice, never had any intention. But I got a great education for almost free. And for me, it was an intellectual triathlon. It was really hard. And I liked that, and I needed that. And I still use it every day. But so, and I had a wonderful dean, Mark Udoff, who's still one of my mentors. He's still around. He went on to run the University of Texas system, University of Minnesota system, University of California system. One of the great educators. And he would always, I'd come to him and say, you know, Dean, I've got a job offer in Kentucky, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey. He would say, we've been here for 100 years. We'll be here for 100 more. You go do your campaigns. I'll save your seat. How wonderful. And so I am a lawyer. I passed the bar. But I never have practiced, never have wanted to. But it was really good for me. It was good for my brain. And I regret that it's so expensive for others today, getting to Zell's most important accomplishment, which is throwing open the doors of college opportunity to kids whose dads were salesmen or soldiers. My wife's dad was a soldier, and all four of her siblings went to University of Texas. So,
well, a more full-throated endorsement of the Socratic method we will not hear. But you've mentioned Kentucky and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and if memory serves, those were some of those places where you had worked on campaigns and sort of in the 80s, and you and Carville and cutting your teeth on different camp. What was it like? You're a Texas guy. You work for Ann Richards and Lloyd Doggett. Yeah, how then can you transplant or transfer those skills that you've learned in Texas to more diverse places or less diverse places, depending on how you look at it, like Kentucky and New Jersey and Pennsylvania? How does that translate?
pretty easily, actually, Ashton.
Hmm?
To be perfectly accurate, I volunteered for it. I didn't work for her. She wouldn't have known me to hire me back then. We wound up friends. But I think for me, I got in this business, well, first off, as a travel guy. I traveled with the candidate, carried his bags. This was Doggett. Because I had interned for him, he put me on a project to compile. He'd already had a long career. He started in the state senate in his 20s. So he wanted to compile his scrapbook and everything he'd ever done in public life. I did not know this, but with an eye toward running for the US Senate 84. This is about 81, 82. And so I got to know his record perfectly, better than he did. Then when I traveled with him, and we were the low dollar campaign, so we'd stay in supporters' houses and stuff. But I got to know him personally even better, but I got to know his voice. And I knew how he would talk about things. So after Carville took over the campaign, and after a couple of weeks or months of this, he said, you need to come back to headquarters and be the speechwriter, because you know his record and his voice better than anybody in this building. And it was such a gift. And so I learned that, like, if you can figure out the candidate's voice, most importantly, but just listening and being open, I think today they call it code switching.
Mm-hmm.
My wife can tell when I'm on the phone with my friends and family in Texas because the accent comes storming back. But I think it's useful. I've been to all 50 states. I don't know how many countries I've worked in. And that's the thing, is it's just like listening and learning and absorbing. And to me, it's not that hard because it's America. Okay, the learning curve overseas is straight up. I mean, I spent a little time with New Labour back in the day in Britain, and you'd think it's a very similar country. It's so different that I don't know anything about it.
Oh,
but I can figure out Kentucky. Okay,
UK politics is my hobby. That's one of my dear friends is the president of the Liberal Democrats of the UK.
Oh wow,
newly Lord Pack, Mark Pack. He's a
oh wow.
actually.
By the way, I'm a colonel.
Oh well, there you go.
Steve Beshear, the former governor,
that's
daddy
right.
of the current governor, made me a Kentucky colonel. But so I do think like the most important thing to develop is an ear and a sense of empathy. This is something actually Clinton really, really instilled in me. Everybody has a story. Everybody is smarter than you. Everybody has lived a life that you cannot even imagine. And so you try to draw that out of them. And I really hate on my side when the left looks down on people that voted for Mr. Trump or places, in the middle of the country, like where I grew up, or you did. It's really grinds my gears. And so if you turn loose of that, this need, I guess, that we all have to look down on other people, it really does help make it easy to say, well, okay, I can figure out Iowa, or I can work in Pennsylvania, or here's what New Jersey is like.
So tell me about talk about finding somebody's voice. When I think of Zell Miller, there's nobody quite like Zell Miller in politics that I can think of right off the top of my head. And I'm a historian who studies Georgia politics and Southern politics, which is so in a way Zell was sort of he had one foot in the past and one foot in the future, or at least was a governor who helped make the future possible for Georgia, and you've alluded to that. Tell me how you got introduced. You and James got introduced to Zell Miller.
Well, very separately. James had worked for Zell in his Senate race
Okay,
in
yeah, the 80 race against Herman
80
Talmadge. Yep.
against Herman Talmadge. James was associated with Raymond Strother,
Okay,
who
yeah, yeah.
did Zell's ads. God rest his soul. Raymond's gone. His son Dane is still a good friend of mine. And so James had met him then, and you have to let James speak for himself about the impression that,
Sure.
that Zell made. But so flash forward to 1988, and I had worked for President Gephardt, and that didn't work out. So James rescued me and hired me on to work for Frank Lautenberg, senator from New Jersey, running for re-election. And we go to the Democratic convention in Atlanta, and he says, "You got to meet this guy, Zell Miller. He is something, and he's thinking about running for governor, and I really want to work for him, and you should too." And we went to that colossal Marriott downtown, the one,
the Marriott Marquis.
Marquis. Oh my God, it's the biggest hotel in the world. Again, for a small town kid from Texas, I'm like, holy smoke. And I mean, that meeting, I knew I was in the presence of a genius. I think Zell is the only person I would rank with Lyndon Johnson in terms of both his visceral sense and his intellectual sense. And I think you state it very well, Ashton. You say a foot in the past and a foot in the future. He lost his father because they didn't have penicillin around. A simple infection. And he was rooted in that. He used to talk about his Uncle Tom, the poor man's friend. In fact, James helped make an ad in 1980 where he's standing by Uncle Tom's grave. And I think Uncle Tom was walked home from the Civil War or something. It was that long ago. And vowed he would always take care of someone who asked for help because he had to walk home from wherever the last battle he fought was. And yet he had a strong sense of the changing Georgia and how it would change. And others didn't. Democrats always believed if they ate right and exercised, it'd be a one-party state. They were still psychologically rooted in the county unit system, which we didn't have in Texas. And I was gobsmacked when he explained that to me. Really? So Towns County gets as many votes as Fulton County? And, that system made you go courthouse to courthouse.
The Electoral College, but much, much worse.
Much. It was insane. But it demanded a sort of politics that was county by county.
Absolutely.
Courthouse by courthouse, sheriff by sheriff. Because in most of those rural counties, if you're in Telfair County and the local sheriff says, "We're for Zell," you're going to be for Zell. But he knew that had changed. The others knew it was in all the papers, but they didn't act like it. Bubba McDonnell, particularly, Roy Barnes to an extent. Andy was very much the new Georgia. But the other primary opponents Zell had were rooted in the old Georgia. And Miller, coming from the old Georgia, understood how it had changed, and he was always 3 steps ahead. I just can't say enough about what a student of the game he was, and especially, and I'm jumping ahead to when he was in office, but even as lieutenant governor, what he knew, why I compare him to Johnson, who is a political hero of mine. Somewhere back here, I got a picture of him on the wall. He knew power and was unafraid to use it. And so many Democrats, especially today, are afraid of power. They're unsure of themselves. They think somehow power is bad. And Zell believed in power, and he believed in using power to help people like him or his Uncle Tom or his dad who were left behind by circumstance. And I loved that about him. And from the very first meeting, that's how he talked.
Well, you've already described. I mean, he's a very feisty, combative personality, very independent minded, um, to put it mildly. How does that shape how you, as a consultant and a strategist, I don't want to say manage the candidate. I can't imagine anybody managing Zell.
Right, right.
Um, how did you work around or with that sort of outlook and demeanor in a candidate?
You know, James and I often would do a good cop, bad cop thing. And he's a Marine. Zell was a Marine. They really bonded on that. James is very strong and very tough, and so is Zell. They didn't clash as much as you might have thought. I think maybe because they had such similar sensibilities. I mean, they really, James came a long way. Carville, Louisiana was, if you've seen the documentary about
Mm-hmm.
James, it was really a small place. And the only thing they had was a leprosarium and his father's general store. That was it. And so James could really identify with Zell in that sense. And James used to say, Carville was so isolated they had to pipe in sunshine. And Zell used to say, my mother would take me up Brasstown Ball and say, you know what's great about this place? From here, you can go anywhere. And so they had that sensibility. So they didn't clash as much. But I tried to, again, as I always do in campaigns, I tried to travel with him as much as I could, get to know him, listen to him, learn from him. I mean, it really was a masterclass sitting at his knee. And then he, more than any client I ever had, he cared about words and he cared about rhetoric. And he was a brilliant orator. And I mean, if you could put words in Zell Miller's mouth, they would come out so powerfully. And as a writer, oh my God, I craved that. And I wrote for a lot of people, and some could do it and some couldn't. Nobody could do it like Zell. He was absolutely a master and cared about it desperately. And so he would work with me and really drive me, to meet his standards. It was great. It was a wonderful experience.
That's very similar to something Ed Kilgore was
Oh
telling me
yeah,
about Zell. And Ed had worked with Busby and Joe Frank Harris, and that there's no slight to those two gentlemen, but
right,
powerful, great orators they were not.
right.
And I think Ed then getting to work with Sam Nunn and Zell Miller, it was a nice change of pace for him. So
Yeah, yeah.
with
That could really, really give a speech.
right, and he's got the what's his book? Listen to This Voice.
Yeah, I've got it
And it's
over
just
here.
I'm sure it's somewhere on the bookshelf over there.
Yeah,
So
I'm looking for it here.
you
But
sort of
those are the first four words in that convention speech he gave in 1992 in New York.
right when he was a
Listen
keynote
to
of the
this voice.
Democratic National
Only
Convention.
man to do both parties.
That's
But
right. I was not quite old enough to watch the 92, although I
oh
followed the
man,
election as much as a first grader did at the time. Um, I
oh
do
man,
remember that Bill Clinton won our elementary school, our Cambria, Illinois elementary school election. For
that's a good
whatever.
sign.
Well, it was pre-realignment in Southern Illinois, so
Exactly.
that really didn't come until about 2010, and then 2016 really finished off the ancestral Democratic Southern Illinois.
Now,
But
did Kilgore or Mason or anybody talk to you about Zell's 1991? So he's already governor now.
hmm,
Speech to the back then they had regional Democratic conventions,
right,
the
yeah,
Southern Regional Conference or something of
yes,
the Democratic Party.
that's right.
That is a really important speech. I dug it out recently. I could probably find it for. I'm sure you have it, and sent it to my kids who are now all young adults in politics because it was really a powerful statement, and it
Hmm.
essentially said this: the whole point of being a Democrat is to make the economy better for working people. That's why we exist. And everything else is fine, but it's secondary. And he said the economy is the engine and those social issues are the caboose. And he said, we'll have the finest arts council. Oh, and it was that daughter of that great Chief Justice who was the head of the Arts Council. And he said, he had the best anti-AIDS program under Sandy Thurman, who wound up running it for our whole country. He was wonderful on those issues, but that's not what drove him. And he said that. And he said that to the Democrats. We will lose everything if people believe we've lost the thread of making their lives better. And this is the current crisis the
I
Democratic
was getting
Party
ready to
has.
say I don't want to hop too far forward, but this sounds like the I mean every postmortem from 2024 election is what you're talking about, and it's not unique to the Democratic Party. You can look at Labor in the UK.
Right.
It's a similar thing to sort of left to center left parties in the Western industrialized world. It's have social and cultural issues, not necessarily trumped, but they certainly seem to be um, much more high profile than the bread and butter economic politics that you know you're talking about with Zell Miller and
That
LBJ
was his core. That was his core. And I think LBJ, FDR,
or
those
FDR.
greatest
Yeah.
of all Democrats were very much that way. And Zell was part of a group, Clinton was part of it, that really believed that you can do a lot of good on social justice, but you had to first do something on the economy. Miller said, I think in that convention speech, he was talking about Dan Quayle. Like, we weren't all born handsome, lucky, and wealthy. That's why we have a Democratic Party. And I love that. Could you say that today? I don't know. It's not identitarian enough. It doesn't not inclusive enough, whatever.
The groups.
Yes. But so Miller had, I think, absolute brilliant political mind. Really, the top I've ever seen, coupled with this incredible deep knowledge of how government worked and how politics worked and how to get things done.
Mm.
And he, I think, like Governor Cuomo just fine, Mario. But that famous saying Cuomo had that Mario had that was, "You govern in you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose."
Right.
Miller knew how to do both. He could write poetry, he could write prose, and this is much more, the side of him that Keith Mason, Steve Wrigley, Kilgore in the governor's office, others really helped, and who saw.
Mm.
He understood how to use power to get things done in a way, again, that most Democrats are too either uninterested, frankly, or timid. They don't want to use power to force people to do things, even if it meant, free pre-K. Everybody thinks de Blasio is a socialist because he had free pre-K in New York City. I'm like, dude, Zell Miller did that 30 years ago. Free college. Oh, that's Bernie Sanders socialism. Well, Zell did it in 1991.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, this is jumping ahead, and I do want to talk about hope and sort of messaging around lottery in early '90s Georgia, but to your point about using power. So in Georgia, road politics, so road construction politics is really really a beast, and we have in the archives here we have Zell, who wanted to name a new director of Georgia Department of Transportation. And what he said was, yes, by statute, according to the Constitution, you can be the chairman of the state transportation board. But I'll tell you what we're going to do. We are going to create a state transportation bureau, and we're going to take all the money from your board and give it to the bureau. And I'm going to appoint everybody on the bureau. And that and he got a new chairman, and because that's what he was going to do. And yeah, you're right. If we're talking about, I don't want cutthroat is not the right word. It's not necessarily vicious, but it's somebody who understands how the system works and is going to apply the levers of power. It's almost, I would say, almost Daley-esque.
Yes. Yes. And it came from a lifetime in elective office, but also all those years in the semi-wilderness
Oh yeah, especially after
at the
80.
parole board and all of these jobs in state government that he
I
had,
mean, he worked
all
for
those
Lester
years as lieutenant
Maddox,
governor,
of all
chief of
people.
staff to Lester Maddox. He understood power and was eager to use it to help people. Now, some people seek power for their own ends or ego or their money or whatever. Miller really did want to make a difference to some other kid growing up without a dad, with limited prospects the way he did.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the Hope Scholarship, which was the centerpiece, not the only piece, but the centerpiece, and certainly his primary legacy here in Georgia. Tell me about the lottery and the Hope Scholarship and how that was sort of integrated into the cornerstone of his. Yeah, I think he called it the blueprint for the 1990s.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had to get Miller loved talking about the Georgia that is and the Georgia that can be. Because there's always a north south, two Georgias,
Oh yes.
in Atlanta. And they all say, well, there are two Georgias, and there's the Georgia that is and the Georgia that can be. Well, the way to get to the Georgia can be, in his mind, I think rightly, was all about education. That was the engine of opportunity throughout American history. So democratizing education, throwing open the doors of opportunity in job training, community college, junior college, four-year universities. That costs a lot of money. And man, we had been through the Reagan era. There was a real, because of stagflation, people understandably weren't eager to pay more money. And then Reagan really we're still suffering from it. He had a very successful war against the efficacy of government. And I'm still a dissenter in that war. But my side lost. I mean, most people really believe, the government would screw up a two-car parade. And so he had to fight against all that. And the lottery was a key that unlocked that door. We went through a time right then where a whole lot of states, Carl and I had worked for Wallace Wilkinson in Kentucky in 87.
That's right.
Who went from 0 to governor, defeating Steve Beshear, who was, later became governor and was a good one. And John Y. Brown, who earlier had been governor, was a good one. He beat both of them with the lottery. And it was a simple message: lottery, yes; taxes, no. And now Kentucky, they got a different tradition there, as you know.
They do, yeah.
And so they ain't scared of gambling, right?
Right.
It's the home. Tom T. Hall's from Kentucky. He's got that great song, "Faster horses, older whiskey, younger women, and more money." That should be the Kentucky state song. Georgia, very different now. Zell's a Methodist, strong Baptist tradition there as well. And so he was really a wonderful engine for this, or whatever, keymaster for this key, because he went to a Methodist school, deeply religious, profound faith, and yet he believed that this was a way, and he said Jefferson called it a tax on the willing, that it was the most fair tax, because it was a tax on the willing. And his command of history would allow him to call that forward. So it just worked out perfectly with the lottery. But most places, including where I've worked, like Kentucky, and Governor Richards instituted a lottery in Texas. Everywhere else where I helped and watched create a lottery, they pissed it away. Sorry, they did. It was
I'm
new
from
money.
Illinois.
Yeah. I mean, and so it raises all these billions, and it's just because money is fungible, and it just goes.
Yep.
And
general fund.
It in my beloved Texas, I think it's done no real good for public ed, which is how they sold it to us. Zell knew power, so he structured this in such a way that it had to go to education, and as he forced it through by force of will, and now it's unassailable. They tinker with it here and there, but it's largely unassailable, and it changed the face of that state. I mean, it's the most important state policy I have seen in my lifetime, and the most successful. And it was the combination of his political talent, knowing he could sell a lottery without taxes by still being respectful to the religious community, but also then having that power, structuring it in a way that it became ironclad, and then knowing on the back end politically it would be unassailable. It was absolutely genius. And it's interesting that every other state has tried it practically, and they've all failed.
So you mentioned, some of Governor Miller's opponents in the 90 race, and I want to focus on, and obviously Roy Barnes. Governor Barnes is a good friend, supporter of the Russell Library, but I want to focus on Andy Young, because here we are, 35 years out from that campaign, and the electorates are just so very different from what they are now and what they were then. What was it like running, especially a runoff against Andy Young, the very very high profile mayor of Atlanta, ambassador, congressman, civil rights leader?
Congregationalist minister,
Exactly.
which is a huge deal, very central to his
Hmm.
being. It was fraught.
Right.
It was enormously risky. First off, Andy's brilliant and a great guy. And I saw him actually now several years as Zell was still alive. And he gave me a hug, and I said, "Oh, it's so great to see you." And he's like, "I still haven't forgotten how you kicked my ass in 1990." He was joking,
No, no.
but they never forget. But the most, and Zell, and I don't want to be uncharitable, but Zell had the capacity to be meaner than anyone ever knew in politics. And I loved him. He called me his third son. Okay, he would get me on the verge of tears if I showed up 5 minutes late for a meeting. I mean, because he still was that drill instructor, and he was a hard man, and he never attacked Andy personally, ever. It's very easy in a campaign. It's actually somewhat easier in a primary because there aren't very many issue distinctions that are important.
Right.
So in primaries, they tend to be bitter and personal. And he knew, first off, he honestly liked and admired Andy. Right. He was the first, Zell was first white office holder to endorse John Lewis.
Hmm.
So he was rooted in the civil rights movement, loved and honored Andy, but wanted the same job. And he was absolutely scrupulous in never, ever attacking Andy personally. Now, there's not a lot of fertile territory anyway, because the man has, I think, lived an exemplary life. But he never crossed any lines. And so it was about the lottery, and Andy was against it or not for it enough or whatever. I don't remember, but it was mostly that. Um, and and I give, of course, Andy an enormous amount of credit. But the day after the election, they talked, and Andy said, "Let's go to Pascal's," which I don't need to tell Georgians the meaning
No.
of that place. Let's go to Pascal's and have a unity breakfast. And the general election was difficult, and Johnny's an impressive guy, but that's the day Zell won the governorship, when he was able to win the nomination and have Andy rather embrace him. Really difficult to do today. It was difficult then. Um, it took Miller reining in one of his strongest characteristics, which is his brimming desire to throw a punch.
Which, I mean,
He loved fighting more than anybody ever knew.
you mentioned Johnny, and yeah, that was such a that 90 campaign. Johnny was he was mostly fully formed
Mm-hmm.
in the policies. He was probably more progressive then than he
Mm-hmm.
was as a senator. Um, but I think the one time that Zell maybe did get into trouble was during that debate where he was probably overplayed his hand, especially with regard to Johnny's father, who was sort of he was declining in health and wouldn't be around much longer. Do you remember that debate? I think it was at the Temple.
Do I remember? It was all my fault.
Oh, yeah.
We're going into the debate, and I had really helped a lot with the debate prep, and and Zell was ready. He was loaded, and we had watched Johnny, and we'd attacked him on some vote on the budget. And he said, "Well, I had to vote that way. Speaker made me." Of course, you remember Zell couldn't stand Speaker Tom Murphy.
Oh, no, no.
I had to vote that way because Speaker, and then there's some other thing. I had to vote that way because of my constituents, and I did. I didn't do the redlining at Northside Realty. That was when my father was in charge, and so Zell was ready for that. And Andy had, like any politician, I mean Johnny had excuses for all the criticisms. We all do, but Zell had heard them all, and I had heard them all. So we came up with this line: you blame the speaker for the budget, you blame your constituents for this, and you blame your father. You can't blame the speaker, you can't blame your constituents, you can't blame your father. This is because of you, Johnny Isaacson. Stand up and take responsibility. Well, that was so Zell was loaded for that. We're getting ready to have the debate, and Jay Morgan was Johnny's campaign manager, and he and I went in a room, tossed a coin, to see who was going to speak first. And I don't remember what it was, but I was really priming for a fight myself. And Jay did something that really set me off. I don't remember what. Did or said something, just pissed me off. I came out of there spitting fire, fierce, and I went up to Zell Miller. How dumb is this? I mean, the toughest guy I ever knew, a Marine, and he's already full of adrenaline. And I poked him in the chest, and I said, "You go out there, you don't take any shit off this guy, Zell. You go in there and rip his face off." That's the worst thing in the world. It's the worst thing I could have possibly done is take Zell, who was already at 11, and put him up to 20. And so he was furious, and he didn't even know what Jay Morgan had done or said. It wasn't anything beyond the pale. It was just normal yip yap that, hacks do before debate. So I had him, and so Zell delivers that line just right. But people don't remember it that way. They remember that it did land, and the father's firm had redlined. They had discriminated against Black people. And that is simply a historical fact. Now,
like most real estate firms,
like 100%
in the segregated South,
100% of white-owned real estate firms in the South. But Johnny didn't inherit 100%; he just inherited one. And so, I'm fine with that. But the way I had Zell do it, most fair-minded people thought he was attacking Johnny's dad, because Johnny then, and he meant it. It was authentic. He had tears in his eyes, and he said, "You say what you want about me, Zell Miller, but don't you ever attack my daddy." And oh my God, it was a disaster, because that was the one time where, it was all my fault, where Miller had just really unleashed in public what he would do, to any of us if we had failed him. It was not good. I think it was Wrigley told me when he was chief of staff, there was somebody like the head of the prisons or somebody really hard, and Miller screamed at him so hard that the guy walked out of the governor's office and threw up in the wastebasket.
It was Wayne Garner.
Wayne Garner. So Miller so that's all my fault. And God, if Zell were here, he'd tell you I screwed that up. But Johnny was a good guy, and I didn't do with Johnny what we did with Andy, which is be respectful, but it was just that night, that moment, and I later, even at Zell's funeral, I hugged Johnny and he hugged me, and he wasn't altogether healthy even then. But I'm not proud of that, I have to say. Actually, it's funny now, but in the moment, I really did a disservice to my client.
Well, you came through it. This is 1990. Governor Miller wins. Otherwise, we wouldn't be calling him Governor Miller. Did you get a sense then that the politics in the South were changing?
Yeah. Yes. But in that sense, I thought it was changing, that there was this new generation of Democrats. Who were really impressive. You had, of course, Zell. You had Bill Clinton in Arkansas. You had Ray Mavis in Mississippi. Buddy Roemer was a Democrat back then.
That's right.
In Louisiana. Yeah. Mark White in Texas, and later. So yes, there were all of these really impressive, younger than Democrats in the South who had a different way. They none of them were like anti-choice or anti-gay or any of that shit, but they were really focused on jobs and schools. They were really tough on crime, and so they were right where the voters were, and it was a terrific time to be a Southern Democrat. We didn't know it was the end of an era, but that's typical of the Democratic Party.
Did Zell have any association with the Democratic Leadership Council? Or was that primarily Nunn?
I think he did. It was Clinton, Nunn. Nunn was much more prominent. Clinton, Nunn. Gephardt was the founding chairman. You'd have to ask Keith. Yeah. Yes, he was involved, but not in the same way that Senator Nunn was. Senator Nunn was a real engine of that group.
Right. But you're talking, Senator Nunn, that was his last campaign, was 1990. And he was what? 56?
That's amazing.
Maybe?
And he's still a towering figure. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah, I've got the sign that's sitting out on my other desk. You can see it, blue, white letters, Nunn, Miller, Howard, 1990. Wow. And you think about 94, of course, I don't think you were involved in the 94 reelect, were you?
Somewhat, but not. Yeah, oh yeah, I was. I definitely.
That was
not at the same level.
a much different ball of wax, that 94 campaign.
Well, because we were going through what was then the toughest midterm in Democratic Party history.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, President Obama led us to a bigger defeat in 2010, but my boss, Bill Clinton, led us to what was then the worst defeat we'd ever had in a
Yeah.
midterm. And Zell Miller in Georgia hung on. Mario Cuomo in New York did not,
Right.
but Zell Miller hung on. Ann Richards in Texas did not.
Mm-hmm.
But Zell hung on, and it was talent and tenacity, grit, and oh my God, did he tear apart Guy Milner? I mean, that was a wholly negative campaign. Zell was up for it.
Oh yeah, that I interviewed Guy at his home in Atlanta, and to his credit, I would ask him, I usually, you're a businessman getting into it, and he was he's like, I was a terrible politician. I thought these skills were one-to-one transferable, and that just simply was not the case. That said, he still came within what 36,000 votes of being governor in 94. So what is it to say that the Zell Millers hold on, Lawton Chiles holds on in
he defeats
Florida,
Jeb Bush,
because Jeb was supposed to win, George was not.
Yeah.
Is something about, there is a lot of overlap in terms of cultural competence between a Lawton Chiles and a Zell Miller.
It's very insightful. I think it might be the most powerful thing you can say about a politician is he's one of us.
Mm.
Now, at some point, that gives. I always thought John Tester was one of the great examples of that.
Oh yeah.
The senator from Montana. He's one of us, and he is as Montana as they come. But Montana's changing. There are a lot of Californians who move there who are not like Tester, right? Lifelong farmers, and so the place has changed. But Zell was Georgia. He was one of us, and walking Lawton Chiles in Florida, who had walked the length of the whole state, very much that way. And yes, I think Zell was able to hang on. He did deliver on hope and the lottery and pre-K. He did deliver on crime.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he just barely won because people just wanted change. But he was, I think you're right. I think it was a cultural connection. He's one of us.
Right.
What helped him hang on.
And this is something I think that has been absent from most political campaigns, especially post-Obama, but really since post-Trump, which is it takes an incredible amount of energy and skill to overcome the nationalization of politics.
And it's harder today. If John Tester can't win, who is as rooted in his state, but it was a presidential year. Zell's running an off year.
Right.
Presidential, poor Tip O'Neill's turned over in his grave because all politics is national.
Yeah.
And I lament that. I like the idea that Massachusetts is different from Mississippi. Okay. And in some ways Massachusetts is better, in some ways Mississippi is better. I actually talked to an opposition figure in Hungary.
Oh, wow.
Who's now in exile. He's living in New York, and he was explaining what's been going on in Orban and all this. Mm-hmm. And he said, you have a secret weapon that we don't have, and it's federalism. And it's so interesting. He's like, you have all of these states, and some will do it right, and some will do it wrong. And we don't have that in Hungary. One guy takes over, he's got the whole country. And, some of the stuff he does will work and some won't, but all of it is his, and he controls it. He's like, the president can't really control California and Alaska and, Missouri. And it was just an interesting insight for a guy outside of our system looking at it. And I think that's right. And I think that we're losing that politically.
Mm-hmm.
That, well, will we ever? I mean, Kemp has, I think, a lovely Georgia accent, but, Zell's accent was the mountains. So Appalachian. That's right. But are we going to go into an era where everybody, their accent gets beat out of them like mine? I don't know. I hope not. I like these regional differences, and I love politicians who can go against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
If they make better politicians. Clinton came out of Arkansas. Zell came out of Georgia, which was Democratic, but not ever liberal. or a Romney becoming governor of Massachusetts. That ain't easy to do.
Right.
So I like those against the grain politicians.
Yeah, and it seems like there are places that still do. I mean, this is beside the point. You look at Chris Sununu in New Hampshire,
Mm-hmm.
and oh yeah, the Republican governor from Vermont, and Charlie Baker in
Yeah,
Massachusetts. But at the federal level, that doesn't seem to compute. Whereas here in Georgia, we're the other way right now because of the 2020 and
yeah,
2022 election cycles. But I want to talk about sort of Zell as a cipher for that changing politics
right.
in Georgia, the changing politics, probably more importantly, changing politics within the Democratic Party, which I think is what Zell sort of chafed against more so
Yeah,
than the changes in Georgia, which he helped initiate.
right.
So tell me
I've got
about.
one of his books here, Pert and I
Yeah,
Gone,
yeah.
about how that rural Appalachian life, and he goes on and on about
Mhm.
slaughtering hogs and stuff. And I'm thinking, all of those changes came because of the Zell Miller Mountain Parkway. I never said that to him, but yes, it happens to all of us.
Right.
My two of my kids got married in the last 4 months, and I'm like, we never even should have sent them to kindergarten, honey. They left the house, they went to college, now they're married and they live somewhere else. It's terrible. But you want your state to
Sure.
progress, you want your kids to progress, and then they do, and you miss the good old days.
I have a 10-year-old daughter at home, so
Oh,
now I'm
save your
worried.
money, save your money. The wedding industrial complex is a monster.
There's a
No, it's all
perfectly
good.
fine courthouse here in Athens, Clark County.
That's, but it's all good. But yeah, Zell, I still very much subscribe to his view of politics, and it's why he and Clinton, I think, were so close. And it's use power to help people, right? And I'm not a socialist, and I got nothing. You won't hear me railing against the billionaires like Bernie, but they don't need my help either.
Mm.
And I think that's what Zell would say. Is that I would never agree with Mr. Mamdani, who says there should be no billionaires. He himself's a millionaire, so that's fine. But I do think that when my tax money goes to give Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk another tax break at the expense of kicking some veteran off Medicaid, or closing a veteran suicide hotline, or closing a rural hospital, right? So I think Zell on the economic stuff was right where most people are still today. But I do think some of the social, cultural, identitarian things,
Mm.
even then, were driving him crazy. And today, forget it. But I think I'm jumping ahead, but I think his uh, really deep unhappiness in the Senate was a function of the job and the place as much as the man, or even the politics. So, so Zell finishes out his term, and the president of the United States says to me, "You need to call your friend Zell, see if he wants to be Secretary of the Navy. It's the best job in the government. Best job for Zell as a Marine who really reveres those traditions." So I call him up, and he didn't even call back to answer. He told me on the same call. He said, Shirley has given me like the last 30 years of our marriage, and everything has been driven by my career. And I don't want to do that to her one more time. And I definitely don't want to be in Washington. I was like, Governor, think about it. It's the best. It still is the best job in the government. You'd be great at it, and the president wants you. And he said, no, it was those two things. So Shirley needed to take precedence finally in their marriage, and Washington was never going to be a place he wanted to be. And things happen, and the Senate seat comes open. His governor comes to him, but Barnes handled Miller psychologically perfectly. Comes to him and asks him. He liked Coverdell a lot, and he really mourned his loss.
Yes, very much.
Really, I mean, he cried over
They were
that death.
seatmates in the Senate.
Right, and so to be asked to fill in, not as partisan matter, but to step in for a guy who you loved, who died way before his time. Of course, everything in Zell's life was shaped by the fact his father died when he was 17 days old. So to die before your time is a real heartbreak. And so that's I think that's why Miller was so desperately unhappy in the Senate. in addition to the changing politics. It was a place he didn't want to be. It was a job he although he ran for it once, never really wanted. And then he got there, and he's used to being an executive and getting stuff done.
In Georgia, where the governor is very powerful.
And before that, lieutenant governor was very powerful.
Which is, you run the Senate. Yeah.
But there were no real levers of power for him to exert. Years ago, Jay Rockefeller told me this. He'd been governor of West Virginia, became a senator. And he said, here's the difference. When I was governor, I'd come home and I'd say, you know, Sharon, I did something really big today. I got a children's hospital opened in Martinsburg. We built a children's hospital. He's like, now I come home and I say, Sharon, I had a great day. I gave a speech about children's health care. I never forgot that. And I should have, of course, everybody wanted Zell to take that job.
Yeah.
But I kind of wish I'd counseled against it, but I didn't.
Yeah, you know, hindsight being 2020, you know, Governor Barnes probably should have appointed Buddy Darden, but you know.
Yeah. But I mean, you have this colossus.
But right. Oh yeah.
Great, you know, and
going into a presidential election cycle in 2000, and you know, the calculus made sense.
Right.
Tell me about your reaction watching your friend and former client in New York City at the Republican National Convention giving a speech that you had prepped him for 8 years prior.
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Oh, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. It was very upsetting. As we often do, Carvel and I had very different responses in public. I was very upset personally. So was James. James is my best friend. We talk every single day, but he has never known the pleasure of an unuttered thought. So he went on television and started blasting Zell. And I guess he had donated to the Senate campaign, asked for his money back. You can imagine how Miller reacted to that. Angry, offended, hurt, wounded. I got a call from Zell's Senate colleague, Hillary Clinton. And Hillary said to me, do not attack this man. Do not follow James. You need to shut James up. And I was like, ma'am, have you met James? She said, you got to shut that down, but don't you join in that. It was really an important conversation because she was like a big sister. She said, he has been too important in your life. She didn't say anything about the politics. He's been too important. He introduced James and me to her husband. Mm-hmm. Okay. And he launched my career and I loved him. And she said, he's been too important in your life. And she said, look, the odds are you're going to outlive him. And you do not want to stand at his coffin and regret that you said something hateful about him. It was so beautiful and so human. It had nothing to do with the politics. She just begged me not to join in these attacks. And she loved that man. You know where Hillary was on the day that the Jennifer Flowers issue broke? She was with Zell Miller in Georgia.
I did not know that.
That man put his arm around that woman and said, I got your back. I am here. Good times and bad. I got you. Whatever you need or want, I got you. And so she loved him. Again, politics aside, he stood up at like one of the worst moments of her life. And she weighed in. It's a reason I never publicly attacked Zell for any of that stuff, because she told me not to, and she was right. And James and he made up, and that was good. But it was heartbreaking. I thought it was completely wrong. Okay, I thought Bush was I knew Bush. He was a good man. He's a terrible president. I hated the war, hated it. I had a student at Georgetown lost both his knees above the legs. Both his legs above the knee. Pardon me. It was just, I hated it. And I hated that Zell supported it. I hated that Hillary supported it. A lot of good Democrats did. But then, you know, he just kind of kept going in a whole hog with someone who I didn't think was doing a very good job. I will say, flash forward to that funeral. Mm-hmm. I can't think of anybody who ever had three presidents speak at this funeral.
I was sitting in the back that day. That was something.
I was standing there in the family holding room with Shirley, and you know, President Clinton came up, and of course he loved her and knew her very well and said hi. And President Carter, same. Then President Bush came in, and he knew me from Texas. It didn't even, I think, know that I had any Zell Miller connection, much less standing, with Shirley on my arm. And he looked at me. He said, "What are you doing here?" And I ignored him. The question. I said, "Mr. President, it's so important that you're here. I can't thank you enough. This is like the most important thing you could be doing. And I know all of these demands on your time, but it's so important." And then he dropped the kind of the facade, and he said, "Well, there's nothing more important I could be doing than honor this man." And that really meant a lot. And that's so, yeah, I didn't like that Zell supported him politically, but unlike a lot of those people, like Sean Hannity didn't come to that funeral. Like a lot of those people who used Zell when he was useful to them and then ignored him later. I give President Bush an enormous amount of credit as a man of character for coming to that funeral, honoring that man, give a wonderful tribute. But it's so politically, it hurt a lot when he broke with the Democrats and supported Bush.
Well, that his funeral. So this was back in April 2017. Think about all the different people who were at that funeral, and it really did feel like the end of an era, right? Zell had been off the public stage for a while because of his health.
Right. And I had gone up to Young Harrison, seen him, and we spent time alone.
But thinking about Georgia politics today, you talk at the very beginning, you talk about putting diverse coalitions together. There was nothing more diverse in terms of ideology, race, class, gender, as the sort of New South Democratic Coalition, the biracial coalitions of rural white farmers, small town businessmen, and downtown Atlanta, African Americans, academics here in Athens, Clark County. That was the coalition. And that is absolutely not the case today. And all credit to Governor Perdue, now Chancellor Perdue, my boss, for and Paul Coverdell for learning, and campaigning in such a way as to break that coalition. But what's it going to take for Democrats in Georgia to not only be competitive, but to find a way back into power in this state?
I honestly think the best thing they could do is go back and reread Zell's 1991 speech to the Democratic Party about strategy. I wish they would embody his agenda, governing as governor, right, with massive investment in public schools and the genius of hope was it was opportunity and responsibility, as President Clinton would say. Miller considered and rejected advice to simply have free college, as I wrongly called it. You have to maintain a B average for that hope. And he insisted on standards and accountability. No something for nothing. That's a really important thing. And so I think that agenda, but then politically, understanding Democrats, I think it is the same in Georgia as everywhere else in this sense. Donald Trump won the votes of people who make under $50,000 a year. If Democrats can't win the working class, we don't deserve to be a party. And I know Zell would say that. That's a crisis. And I don't think, as of yet, enough Democrats are kind of wrestling with why that happened and how. Some elites simply say, well, they're racist. Well, it's the fallacy of composition, right? All the racists are Trump supporters. But not all the Trump supporters are racist. In fact, most of them are really good people who work hard and they play by the rules. That most of them were Zell Miller voters 5 minutes ago, or Bill Clinton voters.
And you were Barack Obama voters.
Absolutely. And so this is what I hate when the Democrats, we started talking about this, look at people in Missouri or in Texas or in South Georgia, Middle Georgia, North Georgia, everywhere outside Metro Atlanta, and spit on them and look down on them. And they pick up on that. Zell never condescended. He never patronized. He certainly never judged. He just kind of wanted to lift up, and it's a completely different attitude. So I think they very much have to turn loose. You know, they have to be the party of the working class again, of the strivers, and of work and values. And it breaks my heart. And as somebody who's, inspired by and trained by Zell, to see the Democrats uh, lose those voters and seem, at least, so those voters believe with some, I think, validity, that the Democrats look down on them. And it's nobody ever said that about Zell. So that's what it's going to take. It's going to take rejecting the politics of judgmentalism, of woke, of pronouns, I mean, good God, of the censorious cancel culture of the left. And that doesn't exclude the book burning censorious culture of the right either. But I'm a liberal, and liberals believe in free speech. And the notion that the left is like trying to shut down. So I'm about to go back to teaching at UVA. One of the people I'm trying to get to come to my class, he hasn't agreed yet, but I'm working on it, is Vice President Mike Pence. I want Pence there because I disagree with him about everything. Everything. I can't think of one thing I agree with him on. Well, my students will need that, because believe me, they'll get a belly full of what I think. And it's the most liberal thing I can do, is to platform, as the left calls it, to give voice to views that are completely opposite of mine. To trust my students, some may think he's right, some may think he's wrong, but to trust them to make that assessment. That, to me, is like the whole purpose of this deal. And yeah, Zell transgressed, in many ways by associating with the evil Republicans. But I think there's an awful lot of good in that attitude too. And the Democrats have got to get away from this preachy, censorious judgmentalism. Sorry to go on for so long. I'm preaching myself.
No.
Forgive me,
It's an interesting dynamic in Democratic politics, because ever since President Trump in 2016, you've seen a transfer of college educated voters in the suburbs where you grew up, Metro Atlanta, Cobb County, Gwinnett. Those are now solidly Democratic counties, which was absolutely not the case when you were running campaigns in Georgia.
Yeah.
And at the same time, just a wholesale hard right turn from basically every other rural small town county.
Right.
Trey Hood, who's a very, very well thought of political scientist here, he says every election cycle, he doesn't think the Republicans are going to be able to squeeze any more voters out of Banks County and Schley County, but they do. And I wonder, we're coming into a midterm election. And when I was growing up and when you were active in political campaigns, midterms were tougher for Democratic candidates because Democrats relied on low propensity voters. Whereas now, increasingly, Democrats do better in midterms precisely because those highly educated, upper income, especially white women in the suburbs who turn out. And are the Democrats, whether they win or lose or it's a push, is the concern for folks like you that the Democrats, big D Democrats, will learn the wrong lessons from that?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're exactly right. Another guy who's going to come to my class, he committed, is Brad Todd. He's a Republican strategist. I think he's first rate, absolutely brilliant. And he's one of the few Republican strategists I know who will candidly talk about this, about how we're now, he's like, he says this privately, so I hesitate, but some people say, why are we trying to restrict voting when we're the party of low propensity voters? We should make it really, really easy to vote because our people have a harder time voting. And most Republicans aren't there yet. They haven't made the switch either. not to advise Republicans, but yeah, if I was
That's
Republican
why
in
they
Georgia,
struggle when President Trump is not on the ballot.
and they always will until they figure this out. Some like Todd are way ahead, but most are not. You're exactly right. The Democrats are the party of high propensity voters now. And the good of that is in low turnout elections, we win. The bad is, so we're sitting here, what is it, July 28th, 2025. I am so bullish on these midterms for the Democrats, you wouldn't believe it. The last time they cut taxes for the rich and tried to cut healthcare in 2017, the 28 midterms, Democrats gained 41 seats in the House. They'll do better. They will exceed 41. And people, oh, Charlie Cook says there's only 15 seats at risk. Baloney. They're going to win everything that's not nailed down. Because of what you're talking about, without Mr. Trump on the ballot, he has this effect that I call empty the deer stands. Okay, as an avid deer hunter, I get it. All those guys I grew up with, they will turn out in the rain to vote for Donald Trump, but they don't give a rip snort who their congressman is. They just don't care. And they're pretty pro-choice. They're kind of anti-church, a lot of them. You know, they're not what used to be a conservative in America. They used to be a Democrat or not involved. And Trump, God bless him, he has a magnetic hold on them. And so far, nobody else does. And they just don't turn out. So yes, I think it'll be a great midterm for Democrats, but then they'll learn all the wrong lessons, just like they had an awfully good midterm, all in all, in Biden's first midterm.
Yeah.
And they took the wrong lesson from that. So I'm hugely bullish on 26. I'm terrified of 28. Because that's when 27 and 28 is when the Democrats have to really fix their problems. Right now, everybody says, oh, they need a leader. No, they don't. Oh, they need a message. No, they don't. I'm sorry. I had a friend who was a public defender. And I asked him, I said, how many of your clients are guilty? He said, hell, all of them. I said, well, what do you do? What's your defense? And he said, well, I generally use the Saudi defense. I thought, damn, I should have gone to class when they covered that in crim law. And I said, what's a Saudi defense? He said, it's some other dude did it. Okay, that's all the Democrats need for the midterms. Some other dude did it. Your rural hospital's closing, some other dude did it. Your brother couldn't get an answer on the helpline from the VA, some other dude did it.
Right.
Your grocery costs are up, some other dude did it. But that's not enough to be president.
Yeah, you
it's
think
enough for a midterm.
2006 midterms when the Democrats won back the House and the Senate had enough, which was exactly the slogan of the 1946 Republicans, had enough.
Right.
You could say that in 2010 with the Tea Party. It's like, had enough. You mentioned, you referenced the 2010 midterms. Republicans blew out the Democrats, but President Obama won re-election, not as handily as 2008, which was a generational victory for a presidential candidate, but it was an early night.
Oh yeah.
In 2012, as soon as it was 10 p.m. on the Eastern, 10, 11 o'clock, whenever the West Coast closed, it was over. And it feels like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the sort of recriminations or soul searching within the Democratic Party, it feels like the 80s all over again. Where
I wish
you had Fritz Mondale in 84 and Dukakis in 88, but it seemed like there was more unanimity in opinion that something had to change, but maybe we have a false memory because Bill Clinton did win in 92.
I think in 92, well, in 88 to 92, those 4 years, there was a much more serious reckoning with what we had done wrong, we Democrats. Much more serious. Zell was a part of it. Senator Nunn was central to it. Dick Gephardt and ultimately Governor Clinton resolved it. Much more serious. I don't think the Democrats are doing a very serious. A few are, okay. My buddy Rahm Emanuel, a couple of others, but most of them are tiptoeing around it. If you look at this week, the Wall Street Journal poll, the Democrats are at their lowest ebb in the history of the Wall Street Journal poll. Why? because the stain and the stench of a candidate who was 82, handing it off to somebody that nobody voted for, who then was on tape saying that my mother from the Holy Trinity Church Choir should pay taxes to perform experimental gender reassignments, elective gender reassignment surgery on convicted inmates at her cost. Okay, that's insane in the eyes of 90% of the voters. And the stain of that, of defund the police, of the pronouns, the stain of that is much deeper than I had realized until I saw the Wall Street Journal poll. And I've been against it all along, but I hadn't realized the staying power, the stickiness. And the Democrats have to have a much more sober reckoning. I actually think it'll come in 27.
Why is that?
Because you don't need it to win the midterms.
Oh, yeah.
And it might not be useful. But I think in 27, someone is going to emerge. Everybody's going to run. The Democrats have more talent than I've ever seen. And someone's going to run. And that the one who wins, I hope, but also think, will be the one who speaks to those middle-class economic concerns and directly rejects the elitist identity politics. I'm actually hopeful that someone will emerge who does that.
Do you think so much of, I think, what stuck with Vice President Harris was not actually from 2024 or even her time in the administration. It was the campaign of 2020 where not everybody, President Biden didn't necessarily do it. Mayor Pete was much more nuanced. But everybody,
Michael Bennett and Steve Bullock, there were a few.
Yeah.
Most of them were chasing.
Most ran to Bernie.
Well, and worse, not even so much to Bernie as to, I can't even think of who their avatar would be. Bernie mostly talks about economic issues.
He does.
I'm weird this way. I like Bernie a lot as a guy. I like him a lot. Kind of reminds me of Zell in a way, because he's this crotchety guy who knows what he knows.
You know?
Yes. So I have a soft spot for Bernie. I like and admire him. When and I'll name names, when Elizabeth Warren, Julian Castro, Beto O'Rourke, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, all those others who ran, when they thought of the base of the party, they thought of assistant professor of aromatherapy candle making at Wesley, okay, who's minoring in gender studies. And that's not the base of my party. The base of my party is a church lady in Orangeburg, South Carolina, who's a Black woman, moderate to conservative, evangelical Christian. And it's the fringe. When the press talks about the base, they talk about white leftists. It's not the base of the Democratic Party. It is precisely 11%. I mean, I've done the research. I've spent a lot of time on this. 11% of my party, okay? Black folk, and to a great extent, Latinos, Asians, and immigrants, are far, far larger, far smarter, sorry, but they are, and far more moderate. And they'll pick the nominee. That's how you got Biden. Biden didn't have some magical talent like Obama or Clinton. He was the only one who wasn't stone crazy. And so all those really sensible church ladies said, yeah, he's old, but he's not crazy. And so Joe wins more primaries than Barack ever dreamed of, more than Bill Clinton ever dreamed of. He wins 33 out of 54, 52, something like that, because we have, but he didn't win that on his talent. He won it simply by not being crazy. And this is where the Democrats are very different from the Republicans. At Zell's funeral, I talked to Casey Cagle, then the lieutenant governor of Georgia, running for governor. I said, Casey, what do I need to know about your state and your primary? And he said, God, they love Trump. He's like, whoever wins is going to be the Trumpiest, and I'm going to be the Trumpiest. Now, he didn't win, but I think that's a good insight. That's not the Democratic Party. The most woke will not win. In fact, I promise you that. The most kind of middle-class, sensible, Miller-esque, Clinton-esque, Obama-esque, focused on actually your rent, your healthcare, your groceries, your gas.
So if you had to guess, if you want to, if not, we can talk offline. But what do you foresee sort of happening in that sorting in the new Democratic primary? Iowa and New Hampshire aren't the end all be all anymore.
Right. I think you mentioned the British Labour Party. I think it'll be like that. I went over and helped a little bit with Blair and Brown, Peter Mandelson, Lloyd Mandelson, who's now our Britain's ambassador to America, the late Philip Gould. They had the most brilliant team that created New Labour that you've ever seen, and they were terribly interested in the New Democrats. So I went over there, Carver went over there, and I talked with them a lot. I don't want to take any credit, but I found them to be absolutely brilliant. So they create New Labour, and they build the biggest majority anybody ever had. Well, it runs out, as these things do, but it was mostly associating with Bush's war, which was a catastrophe, and then the economic crash. So they run out of gas. And understandably, voters turn to the Tories. Labor then runs to Jeremy Corbyn, the furthest of the fringe. And people like me, I would never go and help Jeremy Corbyn. Never. So they're in the wilderness, losing elections they should win. Because people were tired of Tories after a few years, but they couldn't possibly put Jeremy Corbyn in charge of an important country. I think that's kind of what Democrats are going through. And so then they come back to Keir Starmer. So yeah, and everybody's mad at him now. Oh, he's charmless. You're doing whatever. I don't know. I know this. He rejected the fringe. He moved back to the center, and he won a landslide. And if the Democrats are smart, they will repeat that. But what they will need to do is what Starmer did. And I don't know if they have the guts. They have to pick a big fat fight. Starmer punched Corbyn in the nose. By the way, Trump punched Bush in the nose. Barack punched Hillary in the nose. Bill punched Jesse in the nose. This is what you need. Politics is like, a prison movie. You go first day in cell block D and you punch the biggest guy right in the face. And if you survive, you get to be the boss. And all of my life, that's been how you take over a party. Not by being the nicest, not by being the unifier, but by taking the fringe and punching in the nose and then saying, you don't run this thing, I do. And then voters say, oh, I can follow that. I don't really fault Calm. Like, she only had 107 days to do it. But she was never able to, in part because of time, but maybe also because of temperament.
Well, Paul, thank you so much.
This is fascinating. I seriously, I'm going down there